Okay, so last week, of course, we looked at the rise of merchant capital and its role in the emergence of capitalism. We looked at a lot of different types of merchant capital, from Europe to China, the Islamic empires, the Italian city-states, the Hanseatic League. And then eventually we looked at a case study of Lynn, Massachusetts, where we showed how merchant capital was able to make that transition from trading in goods to production. The things that led to it, the emergence of a national market, transportation systems, availability of credit, and what have you. So today what we're going to look at is the role of the state and imperial expansion, and specifically the role that it plays in the rise of capitalism. And in particular, we're going to look at the development of plantation slavery in the Caribbean, Brazil, and a little bit in the American South. Now, we'll be sort of advancing two main arguments today. The first argument will be what began as an effort to solve one of the crises of European feudalism, the need for royalty to secure wealth for consumption and war, became by the 18th century a dynamic and new phase of emergent capitalism. Secondly, we'll look at the rise of racially based plantation slavery and how it linked different parts of the global economy in entirely new ways. Now, what I mean partly by efforts to raise revenue, if we look at the first argument, is we're talking about how different places in different countries in Europe tried to solve this sort of crisis of feudalism. Now, I'm going to divide the lecture basically into two main parts. Even though there will be videos that will vary in length, the shortest one probably being this little introduction I'm giving, to some longer ones later in the lecture, it will basically be in two main parts. The first half of the lecture is going to look specifically at Spain and Portugal, and it's going to address really that first question that we're looking at here. As I said, England was not the only country that was going through a crisis of feudalism, even though during that lecture 2 weeks ago, the focus was on England and the development of commercial agriculture. This was a European-wide phenomenon, right? The plague, the Black Death, decimated the population all over Europe, in France and Spain and Portugal, parts of Italy, the German states, everywhere. And every country had a sort of different way of getting out of the crisis of feudalism. As we saw, the consequences of how England dealt with the crisis of feudalism led to the emergence of commercial agriculture, which I'm going to recap a little bit in the second video. Now, other countries also looked to get out of the crisis of feudalism. In France, for example, what you see out of that crisis is a different route. We see the emergence of absolutism in France, right? When you think of Louis XIV, 15th, and 16th, right? The sort of absolutist state that was much more centralized in a lot of places, but ultimately just transferred what was a feudal system from local landlords and control really into the central government. Now, other countries as well, specifically Spain and Portugal, part of the way they get out of this crisis of European feudalism is to look abroad. And so that's going to be sort of the first aspect of the lecture. The second half of the lecture will address that second argument about the rise of plantation-based slavery and how it linked different parts of the world and its role in emerging capitalism. Now, we will still overlap a little bit looking at Spain and Portugal, largely because the first slaves that end up in the Americas end up in the Spanish and the Portuguese Empire, specifically in the case of the Portuguese in Brazil, in Spain, parts of Mexico, parts of the Spanish Caribbean, and even parts of Peru. But the focus will be mostly on the British Caribbean, because even though the slave trade starts with Spain and Portugal, it's really the British that take plantation slavery into a much more commercially based system with the production of staple crops. It's different, but it's not surprising in a way that it emerges in Britain, largely because the whole concept of commercial agriculture emerges on the English countryside. And then finally, as part of that second half of the lecture, we will also look a little bit at the Dutch Empire. The Dutch Empire in many ways is the kind of connecting threads between the first half and the second half. And what I mean by that is the Dutch Empire was really the empire that turned the slave trade into a much larger system and business and a way to raise revenue than it was for the Portuguese. And the Dutch really are responsible for the transportation, at least initially, of the hundreds of thousands and eventually millions of people who were forcibly removed from West Africa under horrendous and terrible conditions, and then forced to work under even more horrendous and terrible conditions when they arrived in Brazil and the Caribbean, and to a much lesser extent, the American South. So we will look at all of these different empires. We'll look a little bit at the French, but the focus with slavery will be mostly on the British. So, as I sort of hinted, there are basically three waves of imperial expansion. The first wave is Spain and Portugal, and it is really between 1490 and 1590, even though these empires persist well into the 19th century. Cuba is still part of the Spanish Empire by 1898, when it loses Cuba in a war against the United States, known as the Spanish-American War. And the Portuguese Empire, even though, again, it persists well past 1590, Goa, for example, which is a part of India, was still technically part of the Portuguese Empire up until the early 1960s. But by these late periods, the Spanish and Portuguese empires really had been in decline for centuries. And sort of the main thrust of Spanish and Portuguese imperialism is that sort of 16th or sort of late 15th, early 16th, late 16th century, between 1490 and 1590. The Dutch was sort of that second wave of imperial expansion. And it really gets going between 1620 and 1680. The Dutch were largely a trading empire, and of course, as I said earlier, were instrumental in the emergence of the slave trade, especially in sort of scaling it up to a much larger operation. And then the third wave is the French and the British. Even though here you can see technically it starts a little earlier than the Dutch, sort of early French and British imperial and colonial settlements in the Americas. They even start before 1607, but they're mostly a series of false starts. It's not until the early 17th century, 1607 for the British, especially in the Virginia colony, where British and French imperialism and colonialism actually start to take hold. And these colonies eventually grow into what would become the United States and the Eastern Seaboard, of course, Quebec, Canada, but also the Caribbean, which was a much more important part of the French and British empires at this point. Okay. So that's a lot of what we're going to look at today. Also, we're going to go over some key concepts again, specifically historiography. We'll talk about Robin Blackburn's The Making of the New World and slavery, The Making of New World Slavery a little bit later when we look specifically at slavery. And also another book to consider, which is also a candidate for the book review essay, is of course Sidney Mintz's Sweetness and Power, The Place of Sugar in Modern History. If you're interested in the history of slavery, specifically how it contributes to the rise of capitalism in a global context, this is one of the books that I think you would be interested in looking at. Okay, so I'm going to leave it at there for the introduction, and then what we're going to do in the next video is look at the rise of the Spanish and Portuguese empires in the Americas, and to a certain extent the Portuguese penetration into the Indian Ocean and East Asian worlds.